job today to come in and give just sort of a flavor of where the science is on minimum wage and what's good and what's bad about it. So I'm going to have a few charts here. So I'm going to share my screen, which means you'll see less of me and more of the screen. All right, so hopefully you just see the shared screen. I'm going to go to the first slide. I think I'm going to go to the first slide. Come on, there you go. Okay, so here's a history of the federal minimum wage. So I want people to sort of see this. We've heard that it's always been higher or always been lower or whatever. What we can see is really since the 1980s, the federal minimum wage has bounced basically just a little bit below $8 an hour using today's dollars. So this converts everything in the past to today's dollars. In 1947, the minimum wage was 40 cents an hour, but adjusting it to current wages, it's a little over $4 an hour. So you can see during the early 70s and the 60s, the minimum wage adjusted for inflation was running higher than it is more recently. And at the time, it was bouncing right around $10 an hour at the federal level. But overall, since World War II, the federal average has been $8.30 an hour. And that's just a little bit below where you are right now in Florida. So right now, your numbers are very close to what that average is, actually a little above it. So it sort of gives you a history of what's going on because you hear a lot of different things. And adjusting for inflation, this is what we're seeing. All right. So I'm going to do positives, and then we'll do some negatives, and then we'll talk about some of the efficiency issues that happen with minimum wages. So why minimum wages? Why are they worried about minimum wages? Why do people want them? It really comes down to three things. One is the fear of an information asymmetry between workers and employers. And by this, we mean that particularly with low-wage employees, they tend not to know very much at all about the business. And so they have very little idea about the worth that they're creating for the business. And so they don't know how to negotiate a reasonable wage for themselves. All right. Therefore, there's a thought that this would generate greater wage power for employers than there is for workers, and therefore we might underprice the value of labor in those low income jobs. So that was the original reason that we really brought about the minimum wage. More recently, we've started to worry about other things like the living wage. So you'll hear lots of people give an argument about we need to have a living wage for people working on minimum wage. So, this has some benefits for us in both directions. It reduces the need for other government programs a little bit, which is nice. And it's nice that people can live on what they're earning. And finally, there's a political desire in now the last 10 to 15 years to address wealth and income disparity for families. All right. So let's think about that a little deeper. Right. I apologize. I'm giving lots of words. I normally don't use words on my PowerPoints, but I think for this particular topic, it was the easiest way to show the information. So living wage, the last ALICE report that's publicly available for Florida is 2018. ALICE is a report generated by the United Way about asset-limited, income-constrained employees. So we're looking at people who are making enough to, what's the number they need to live in a modern society? Nationwide, this ALICE number is normally between 2 and 2.5 times the poverty number. And you can see that that's the case in Florida. The poverty number in 2018 was just over $1,000 per individual. and the Alice number was just over $2,000 per individual. What's key to think about this, and I also note the retail wage, the average retail wage, which is a number economists will often use as relatively low-skilled workers who can come in and out of the workforce, often are more part-time, so it tends to be near the lower end of our wages that we pay, is $11 an hour. If we took Alice, Alice would be about $12 to $13 an hour in 2018. It would be about $15 today. So that $15 an hour that's being talked about is pretty close to that Alice wage for an individual person if they were working a minimum wage job for over 2,000 hours a year. We know that type of minimum wage job doesn't exist in a lot of places, but if they're working multiple jobs. Often you'll hear that the minimum wage is way below what it needs to be the living wage. And most often what people are doing is giving us what people need for a family of 4. So if we had a single income earner for a family of 4, you would actually need $35 an hour to hit the Alice threshold. Because now you'll see as we start adding family members and who have different types of needs, the people at the United Way add in different things that you need for all those different people. So it goes up faster than the poverty rate, all right? But because you need daycare and other types of things that you don't need as a single person. So what we're seeing right now on that side is this argument that we hit this living wage, it will help with income disparity, and it will make sure that there is a, quote, fair wage. So what's some of the problems with this thought process? Well, 40% of workers in the United States who are earning minimum wage live in a family that is earning at least 300% of the poverty. So that's a big difference, all right? So you have a lot of people like teenagers or college students who actually are part of a family that earns a lot more money, and they're using this at the front end of their career to gain experience. So now you have to start wondering about how do you piece together all of that training concepts along with this concept of having somebody work and earn what they need to live. There are other ways to get people money if they are below a level that allows them to live. And those include subsidies like SNAP, or up where I live here in Michigan, heating assistance, those types of monies that come into the game. All right. So is this the most, or is this the best way to help people reach these ideas? So here's some of the negative sides to this. All right. CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, has studied this several times. Some economists like this type of model, some don't. But I can tell you I've read probably close to 100 minimum wage studies, and that's just a drop in the bucket on minimum wage studies. And in general, the CBO falls pretty much in the center of the types of things that are found. So it's a pretty safe place to go. You'll hear people who are on either side argue that it's not. But if you look at the totality, most of the current literature will have much of this same results. Okay. So the CBO estimated that going to $15 an hour by 2025 would result in an average of 1.3 million workers nationwide that would have had jobs that will no longer have jobs. So that is for that low wage group on the order of 25% of that workforce. So it's actually a pretty sizable number. Some other studies have found that number to be more on the order of 10% for a large increase in the minimum wage. So we're still looking at people who are working in these jobs losing some of their jobs because they're now paid more than it's worth for the companies to have them on board. So that's one thing that we need to look at. Some recent studies have shown that as the minimum wage goes up, that we get closer and closer and closer to the negatives, things like people losing their jobs, outweighing the benefits of the additional income. All right. We'll talk about that in a second, but there's a trade-off that's happening. A recent article also finds that 75% of the costs go to the consumers in the form of higher prices. So what we're really looking at there is that as we increase our minimum wage, most employers, because they aren't releasing as many workers as they would have to break even, they now have to increase their prices. And as they increase those prices, it leads to people in the middle class and people in the upper class now being made worse off because their real incomes go down because they have to pay more for things. So now this is a transfer of income from people who are more wealthy, above 300% of the poverty zone. Okay, so more wealthy in this case doesn't mean wealthy, it means more wealthy. And people who have less income below the ALICE threshold. All right, but generally, almost all recent studies find almost no employment effect if it's a small change. So when we see things go up by $1, 50 cents, those sorts of things, we tend not to see much change in employment at all. But when things start changing by 50%, by many dollars an hour, then we start to see increasing changes in employment, particularly employers without pricing power. So we see the largest effects for employers that have exposure to exports. So if you have exposure, you're not most of our minimum wage jobs in the United States are service. But if you're in an industry where you're competing with competition from other countries or even other states, you're across the line in the next state and you don't have to pay the same minimum wage, those things actually lead to the inability to increase your prices. And therefore a greater effect happens on decreased employment. More people have to lose their jobs and decreased profits for firms, right? We also find that that the reason you don't see a lot of change in employment as you make small steps is generally there's startup costs to switching to technology substituting for labor. So when we see big changes, then you start to see more self-ordering kiosks, you start to see more fill out your own form and hit a button, then we'll come and do something for you. You start to see more technology and capital substituting for labor. But it has to be a big enough jump for that to happen. Recently, that number seemed to be right around $13 to $18 an hour, depending on which state you were in. Okay. So I think that covers that part. So the next thing that we have to think about is if what you're really concerned about is the second two items on that positives list. So if you're not worried about the interaction between labor and employee or employers, and what you're worried about is this income distribution type of answer, there are inefficiencies to increasing the minimum wage. So we can see that here because when the CBO modeled this, they modeled both a $15 minimum wage and a $12 minimum wage. And what you can see is the real incomes for low-wage workers really went up under that $15 per hour. So there was $64 billion gained nationwide for that increase in the minimum wage at 15. But it was only $12 an hour, or $12 billion at $12 an hour. So that's a big difference, a big gap. So that really supercharged what you were giving to poor people or less well-off people. But we can also see the negative effects also grew, and they grew faster than the positive effects. So if we look at income from lost jobs, there wasn't a lot of lost jobs at a $12 minimum wage. Remember, the average retail wage is almost $12 an hour in Florida anyways. And with large major employers like Target, Walmart, Amazon, all putting a floor on their wages of $15 an hour right now, realistically, there's going to be very little effect of moving to that $12 an hour range. Okay, and you can see the lost jobs was only $3 billion. Incomes for business owners at $15 an hour, it was $14 billion lost. Now nationwide, that's tiny. That's a very small effect, but it is an effect. And for businesses that are on the margin, it will affect their ability to stay in business. At $12, it barely budged the incomes of business owners by only $3 billion. But you should see that the people who are most affected by far are consumers. So what ends up happening when we go to that $15 minimum wage is it will force people to increase their prices across the board. And you'll see many increases in price. And those increases in price effectively take $39 billion out of people's pockets because of the higher prices, all right? Versus only $7 billion in the $12 minimum wage increase. Why is this important? Why am I going through all of this? Add up the lost numbers and compare it to the positive number. So economists worry about how efficient something is. So you add those up and I get to $9 billion more lost than gained when we look at the $15 minimum wage versus $13 billion lost for a $12 billion gain. That loss is the efficiency loss that happens. When we take money and we transfer it around, every transfer affects the ability to create inefficiencies in the system, all right? So the larger the increases, the more efficiency problems we will have, and it will be a larger chunk of that. So as that efficiency grows, one of the things that we have to think about is what we're really worried about is making sure people have food on the table. Is it cheaper to give them money or food than it is to increase their wage from a societal point of view? If it is, we need to be thinking about how we bring that into the game. All right. So I'm going to sort of summarize things here. And then I'm expecting that given the type of group this is, I will have questions. And the questions will probably be more distinct as to what issues you're really worried about. So with the summary, we know certain things. Small, well-telegraphed changes in the minimum wage have very little effect on businesses and really have a small effect on the less well-off. But when you go to large ones, it creates a lot of waves in the pond. And those waves create uncertainty. That uncertainty makes it harder to make business decisions, and it may accelerate the businesses that choose to leave particular industry, right? We know that, that many people at $15 an hour would be making a living wage for an individual person if they worked all year long, all right? But many of those people are people, but other people will be losing their jobs, particularly teenagers and part-time workers will end up losing their jobs and not have those opportunities. Now, I know you have some safeguards in all of this, but it's still tricky to navigate, and people have a harder time understanding what they need to do, and that still leads to those problems. And we need to worry about how we transfer income into between people in order to minimize that efficiency loss that we're going to have. Effectively, this is a tax. I know people don't like to call things taxes, and so the people who really want to have this increased will not want it to be called a tax because people have negative reactions to that. But to an economist, this is no different than a tax. And taxes have something called a deadweight loss, a loss that happens because trades that would have happened at the previous price don't happen now because the price is too high. And we need to be worried about that. And at $15 an hour, you're getting close to that transition zone where that becomes a bigger issue. So I think that's my high-speed look at this. I took 20 minutes like I was asked to take. And so I'm going to stop sharing, which will allow the people actually looking at the chat to tell me if there's any questions.
Well, Dr. Isely, thank you so much. That was absolutely enlightening, and I'm sure that there are going to be plenty of questions. I believe that Mr. Steinacher has a question to lead us off. So, Chris, since you're on camera, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Matt. And please, if you do have any questions, let's let Matt know in the Q&A, and we're going to get to those. I have two questions, Dr. Isely, and thank you again for what we're trying to do is, as Matt's shirt looks, and yours too, purple, we're just trying to make sure everybody gets both sides of this information, because I'm a little worried that any of our social media feeds and others only gives us the side that we root for or that we are part of. So I think that's really important, because in a community, we have to make those hard decisions together. So let me ask you, the one that we've always been proud of in St. Pete is our cost of living has always kind of been at average or a little under the average. You know, cost of living index, it's 99, 100, something like that. And that's a really neat thing for us to, that feels like St. Pete's been an affordable place for folks. Does, it sounded like you said that this, doing something like this, does it affect the cost of living? I mean, like, will we see our index go up because of something like this? Or, so let me ask you the second part to add to is, since we're doing it in incremental year, each year it goes up a little bit, will it be noticeable? Because you talked about incremental growth maybe being able to be digested. So help me understand both, how does it affect our cost of living? And then does the strategy that the Constitution amendment that we're voting on about this incremental help digest any of this at a pace that makes any of what you just talked about any different?
Right. So cost of living will go up for everybody. So compared to other cities in Florida, you won't be relatively worse off. Probably places that are more beholden to service industry components will see larger cost of living increases. And in Florida, because you have a large tourism element, some of that deadweight loss will be borne by tourists who are coming into the state. But obviously what we see with minimum wages is they make a one case fits all. And if we think about Florida in the Panhandle versus Florida in Miami, the cost of living is substantially different. And that substantial cost of difference isn't being mitigated by the difference that we're seeing by one size fits all minimum wage. And so in some places it won't be as high as it needs to be. In some places it will be too high. And that creates other types of inefficiencies that happen. And I lost your second question.
It was about the incremental, the way we're implementing it, and we're not going right to 15.
Right.
And so does that affect this ability for us and our employers not to lose as much, or the impact to everybody else?
So the CBO estimates that I gave you here of the 15 was actually looking at it transitioning to 15 from 725, right? 7, I have my state's over 11, so I don't ever think about the federal. That was doing a transition from something just a little below what you had to 15 by 2025. So it's very analogous to what you're seeing in your state. They were doing the steps like that, and they made the calculations based on that, which is part of the reason I grabbed the CBO version, because it was so close to what you're actually looking at there in Florida. So yeah, it helps. It makes it so it's not quite as bad. But again, it's a big shock to the system in a very short period of time. And so it will be a little bit more of a shock than say, hey, let's do this over a longer period of time, or let's do part of it and then have a review and say, where are we at? And was there a problem? And if there's not, then you do the next step. Those things are hard to do. People are worried that if they don't get it done all in one step, that they'll never get it done. And so from a political point of view, that's not as optimal. But from getting it right, that's important. Because it is possible to increase the minimum wage far enough that you have negative effects on poor people. So there was a study in Washington that's now had a second rendition of this that's decreased the size of the problem. But they found that making their last jump to just above $13 an hour resulted in the negative effects outweighing the positive effects in their early studies. So that list of negative things for less well-off people. And part of the problem here is the data. It's really hard to get data that's disaggregated enough for people to actually study these things. And so a lot of these studies are done on food service people who are also tipped, and that creates a whole nother set of problems.
But what you're talking about is that kind of that poverty cliff too, right? So if we increase it, then they don't get the other government benefits. And is that why that 13 was a trigger? I mean, because they lost some other additional benefits, or no?
No, that was, in their study, they showed that the labor effect outweighed the income effect when you reached a certain point. Now, that was a very localized increase in their minimum wage. It was a city level increase. And so competition could move. And the study more recently has narrowed that or even brought it closer together. But it also says that as the went up, the ability to use this to gain wealth and income for less fortunate people, it becomes less and less effective at that.
Gotcha.
Yeah, there is a cliff. Here in Michigan, it's about $3. So, so if you're sitting at the minimum wage, you need to go up at least $3 in order to pay for coming off all of the benefits that you get below that.
So if you had a $12 an hour job and you got a 16, you should take it because you're going to be all right. But if anything less than that, you're probably breaking even or not. But as far as the resources now, it might be a career move and all that stuff. But as far as just so that's what you were saying for that, correct?
Right. And I don't know the gap in Florida, but that's what it is in Michigan.
Gotcha. So we do have a couple questions. From Mike Funch, a $9 billion dead weight loss is noise in a $20 trillion economy.
Mm-hmm.
Would this issue be most efficiently managed by increasing the earned income tax credit, EITC?
Well, I think efficiency would argue that certainly an earned income tax credit would be a good way to go. It's going to be more efficient, and it's taking away an inefficiency of an income tax. In essence, income taxes are highly inefficient. What we can see, wealth taxes are even more inefficient than that. But income taxes aren't overly efficient. So moving to an earned income tax credit allows a lot of people to end up really not paying taxes. And taking advantage of a bureaucracy that we already have. The short answer is that depending, and there's not been a lot of studies on this because it's so political. You know, your chances of getting published go down if you don't align with some sort of political view. That it's really a mixture of the two things. Having a minimum wage to address the first issue, where we're worried about that information asymmetry, is very useful. And choosing that optimally then will allow you to decide how much additional you'd have to do through an earned income tax credit or some other subsidy that you want to do. But that's not how we do it. We decide, let's move it to this, and then we figure it all out.
Dr. Isely, is there an estimate of savings in government support programs at the $12 or $15 minimum wage level? And that's from Paul Carter, one of our board members.
All right, so I anticipated that question. And there's a recent paper that attempts to do that. And they did it, I'm looking at the paper here quick. What they found is for one that's a little bit less than the range that we're talking right here, that for each additional increase in income, each dollar increase in income, it resulted in a $1.15 decrease in support. So, so there's two sides to that. First, if we're reducing support by $1.15, it means you aren't getting as much money to people who are less well off. But it is generating savings from that side of the game.
So repeat that. So $1.15
for every dollar increase in the minimum wage, with a $1.15 decrease in support. And I can't remember whether that was Andre Dube or whether that was Peter Harris stuff. But if people really want to read the paper, you can let me know. If you like dry reading to put yourself to sleep at night, we can get you economics papers.
Great. Our next question is, has there ever been a discussion or studies that look for a two-tiered with lower wages for students who work part-time versus adults working $2,000 a week?
Mm-hmm. And there's certainly been many places that have attempted to do the two steps. And the real issue is once you bring it out to a family level, the students who are working are a very negligible piece of the family income. They're probably working part-time. They're earning very little compared to the average income. And so it's really the effect on the other workers that washes things out. But they're the ones who are disproportionately affected the most early on. So really what those studies need to look at is how does it affect their future ability to find jobs and be good workers, because they didn't have the opportunity as a teenager because the job didn't exist because the minimum wage was too high. I haven't seen a study like that. There maybe one exists, but I have not seen it. So I think that answers your question. Certainly there'd be a lot of reason to have, because of that 40%, and the 40% is by and large very young people getting their first job. Having a training wage certainly is something that is reasonable, but it complicates things. And anytime you complicate something the government is doing, it increases inefficiencies.
Gotcha. Do we know what the age demographics are for people earning less than $12 an hour, $15 an hour?
Now you're going to make me actually look something up quick. I'll have to get that for you.
Okay.
However, there's an easy report to grab that from, now that I'm thinking very quickly, because they do diagram that out in the Florida Alice report for you. So the Florida Alice report gives you the percentage of people below Alice for almost every demographic that's there. And Alice for a single person would be between $12.50 and $13.50 an hour, depending on which type of person you are.
Gotcha.
So that's a very good report. They do one thing I disagree with in that report. They show an economic impact of everybody reaching Alice, but it doesn't appear that they did a dynamic impact, which means they didn't take into account the increases in costs and prices and things like that. They just said, what's the value to these people? So just understand that if you go and look at the report. So I don't have the answer, but I know where to find it.
Okay. Will the savings to government programs be realized? Will the savings to government programs be realized only if the government cuts taxes, or will we see those realizations otherwise?
Well, you'll see those savings realized because they won't have to make the expenditures. People's incomes will have gone high enough that they won't have to spend money on as many food stamps or as many food assistance or clothing assistance or child assistance programs. What we do see is that will happen one way or the other.
Okay, gotcha. There's been a lot of discussion on wage disparity of the owners versus the lowest paid workers. Do you have the statistics offhand on the increase in CEO pay versus worker pay in the US over a period of time, i.e. 1970 to today?
Yeah, that's an interesting set of numbers, and it's one that's hotly debated. So we certainly have in the economics world. And the trick is how do you count for stock? Okay, so Jeff Bezos has nearly $100 billion worth of Amazon stock. So everybody says he's worth $100 billion. Well, Jeff Bezos went and spent all of it tomorrow and got rid of all of that. There are only $800 million worth of shares or so out there. So his wealth is actually a little bit of an illusion in that he couldn't actually spend all that money. It would be much lower than that once it gets priced in. So the ones that find high percentage, really high percentage differential, are adding that in, and the ones who find a smaller gap don't add that in or make an adjustment for that by not marking it to market. I should have looked that up because I anticipated that question. And I don't want to give a number because I know that you're recording this. I don't want to give it wrong. But it's certainly safe to say that that CEO pay has gone up many hundreds of percent faster than the average worker's pay.
In terms of calculating income, do you calculate the government extras? For example, this person runs an affordable housing company. The subsidized residents have many additional items paid for by tax dollars. So are those included in income?
No, and so what I've given you here, those subsidies are sort of held out. Effectively here in Michigan, if you looked at it for an entire year, we see for a single person or a small family that's worth $3 to $5 an hour. We see people who are earning the minimum wage really earning $3 to $5 more than that.
Gotcha. What is the estimated impact to workers close to above the hypothetical increased minimum wage levels, both in terms of jobs lost and having their wages raised?
Right. So what we find is that they also have their salaries increased because you can't have the person who is less skilled now paid more than somebody who's more skilled, and so it results in this trigger. We also find that of that next group, that their income increase is less than the increase of the low on a percentage basis. So this went up by $1, so we increased this by $1, but both of them were paid different amounts before, so the percentage is different. All right, so we see that there are income gains for people all the way up to about 3 times the poverty level. In the scope of what we see going on. At least that's what we're seeing in a lot of this current literature. And so, but they also feel a bigger pinch of the price increases, because as you get closer to 300% of the poverty level, you're more likely to go out to eat. You're more likely to do things where you are now affected by those price increases that are happening. So the net improvement for that next group is positive, but it's close to zero. So in reality, it's that lowest income group, it's the biggest bump. The next income group gets a little bit of a bump, and it's just barely positive. And then above three times the poverty level, it goes to zero or becomes negative overall.
Okay. We've got time for some more questions. One right here. Has anyone looked at the effect on the price of healthcare for the lowest paid workers as wages increase, as many of them would lose ACH benefits or subsidies? Sorry.
I'm sure somebody has. I have not read that. But we do know something. We do know by some very good recent studies that in reality, the thing that really holds back less wealthy people is access to healthcare. So when we looked at, there's a very good study in Oregon, and actually a good one done by University of Michigan, when we increased the expanded Medicare. So we expanded it to a greater group of people. And what they found was that it, at least in the short run, it didn't result in greater health outcomes for less wealthy people. But it did result in one health effect that showed up, and then they were able to follow that up. And that was a reduction in depression. And that reduction in depression was then traced to the fact that they were now able to make job choices, not because of their health care, but because of what jobs had the best advancements for them. They didn't have to worry about losing their job because they broke their arm, those types of things. So it was actually found that that had a much bigger welfare effect than many other things that would happen for lower income people.
Interesting.
I answered your question, but I sort of evaded it really well.
Is there any sense of how much common goods, the cost of common goods would go up? Like, let's say a cheeseburger. How much more would a cheeseburger cost because of a minimum wage increase?
Yeah, I mean, looking at some ones that have happened in places like California, it really came out to about 2 or 3%. So essentially, what it would do is double your inflation rate for a year. So again, its individual effect is hard to tell until you see it happen. But a lot of the most recent studies have suggested that, because again, one worker's income went up by this much, but they make an awful lot of hamburgers. So in order to make enough money to cover that differential, resulted in 2 or 3%.
Yeah, Chris?
Dr. Isely, one other question. I know we're going to wrap up. And so if anyone else has any last questions, and thank you all for the great ones. We peppered a lot of good ones. But let me just put it in context of COVID right now. And, you saw me present the numbers, and hospitality industry has been talked about being hit the hardest, and maybe 38% or 40% of my jobs are gone in that industry and maybe not coming back. Some will, some won't. Can you just speak to, or do you have any sense of the impact to do this during this kind of, does it matter if we were going to do this, is this a good or a bad time based on just the impact of that industry itself right now, and everybody else not wanting to do, like just the pure uncertainty of our economy? And I know people who need the money are saying, no, it definitely will help me, but I mean it, like how does this affect us during this kind of economic crisis we're in right now?
Yeah, I mean, this particular recession really has hurt small businesses more than it's hurt almost anybody else, at least at this point, because of the amount of federal aid there was for the first 4 months for the people who lost their jobs. So realistically, what we're looking at is nationwide, 20% of your restaurants are already not swiping credit cards when they were swiping credit cards in March. 37% of your bars nationwide. And so what that really starts to tell us is that we're starting to lose businesses. Now, if we increase the minimum wage, and that for businesses that are on the margin, remember, they can't pass their entire price increase along because other businesses are going to not have to. And so we'll accelerate the number of businesses that we lose. To the extent that other people are able to pick up a business and use those resources, that will come back, but it will create a short-term pop. And more importantly to me, there's a lot of uncertainty around this. So one of the things that I found over the last 5 years is that one of the biggest poison pills for businesses is uncertainty. That people freeze and they don't know how to invest their money. They don't know whether they should go forward with a project or not. And so what they do is they sit on it. And so they lose opportunities. So uncertainty is very bad. To the extent that this is a large enough increase in minimum wage, going from just north of $8.50 to 15. That's a large percentage increase, and so a lot of businesses will have a hard time interpreting what that's going to do to their business, what that's going to do to their ability to recoup that through price increases. And remember, 25% of this comes out of the businesses. So if you don't have 25% of the cost to be able to shoulder, then you're not going to be able to stay in business.
All right, one last question. Is there any good data from Seattle that you could share with me that I could send out to folks here? Now they've been at $15 for a while. Do you know of any good studies that I might be able to find?
I should be able to email you some, Matt.
That would be great.
And Matt's asked the right question. I was going to ask that same one. So thank you, Matt. So Dr. Isely, thank you very much. We're at our time, and I appreciate it. But if there was any other, materials that you think are good resources for a community trying to determine how to inform folks on this, Matt will follow up with you, and we'll get that back out to those folks who attended today. And thank you for that, as well as the rest of our members. But I want to thank everybody who did attend today. I hope you got information that helps you start thinking about it and having the ability to have the conversations with your teams, with your families, with your neighbors, and ideally with our Chamber of Commerce. So we want to circle back with you, help you understand what this all meant for you and for us and our businesses going forward. So Dr. Isely, thanks. And Matt, wrap up for us.
Yep, Joe, just want to thank everyone. There'll be a blog post without this and recording that posted later this week or early next. And we're looking at other conversation in this series to further this before the November election. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. But otherwise, thank you all very much. Thank you, Dr. Isely, and thank you, Courtney, for setting all this up.
Good afternoon. See you guys.
Have a great day.